Standing in the recessed doorway of a high-end boutique on Michigan Avenue, Sarah adjusted the thin, pilled sweater around her shoulders. Her most precious cargo, 4-year-old Leo, was tucked behind her legs, shivering in a jacket that had been outgrown months ago. The glittering Christmas lights of the magnificent Mile mocked them. To the shoppers rushing past with bags from Nordstrom and Apple, Sarah was just a shadow, a glitch in their holiday aesthetic. "Mommy, my toes are sleepy," Leo whispered, his voice small and brittle. "I know, baby. We're going to find a warm spot soon." "Just a little longer," Sarah lied. The weight of the lie felt heavier than the cold. She had lost her job at the diner 3 months ago after a medical emergency, and the safety net she thought existed had turned out to be made of glass. A few blocks away, inside the glass and steel monolith of Sterling Financial, Julian Vane stood by a floor-to-ceiling window. As the CFO of one of the largest investment firms in the country, Julian lived in a world of spreadsheets, quarterly projections, and cold, hard facts. He was known as the iceberg, not because he was cruel, but because he was detached. That night, Julian was preparing for an undercover operations initiative mandated by the board to reconnect with the urban reality of the cities they invested in. He hated the idea. He thought it was performative. He traded his 3-piece tailored suit for a thrifted canvas jacket, a beanie, and a worn pair of boots. He looked like a man who had seen better days, though his posture still held the echoes of boardroom authority. He stepped out into the freezing night, his bodyguard trailing at a discreet distance, instructed not to intervene unless there was a direct threat. Julian walked for 20 minutes, feeling the bite of the air. He saw the city differently from the pavement. He saw the cracks in the sidewalk, the grime on the bus stops, and then he saw her. Sarah was pleading with a security guard outside a luxury department store that was about to lock its doors. "Please," she sobbed, "I'm not asking for money. It's dropping to 10 degrees tonight. Please don't shut down. I just need one blanket for my son. Just one from the display, or a returned one. Anything." The guard, looking tired and harassed, shook his head. "Store's closed, lady. I can't give away merchandise. Move along or I'll have to call it in." Julian watched from the shadows. He saw the way Sarah shielded Leo from the guard's gaze, the way her hands shook, not just from cold, but from the crushing weight of failed dignity. He stepped forward, his heart doing something it hadn't done in years. It ached. The security guard grunted and pulled the heavy brass handles of the door, the click of the lock sounding like a gavel. Sarah stood frozen, her breath hitching in her chest. She looked down at Leo, who was now sitting on the cold stone, his eyes drooping. This was the dangerous stage of cold, the lethargy. "Excuse me," a voice said. Sarah flinched, pulling Leo closer. She expected another lecture, another threat to move along. She looked up and saw a man. He looked rough. His jacket was stained, his hat pulled low, but his eyes were startlingly sharp. This was Julian, though to her he was just another soul lost in the Chicago winter. "I overheard," Julian said, his voice raspy from the wind. "The shelter on 4th is full. I just came from there." Another lie, but a necessary one to bridge the gap. Sarah wiped her nose with her sleeve. "They're all full, or they don't take kids. I just need to keep him warm. If I can get him through the night, I can get to the social services office in the morning." Julian looked at Leo. The boy's cheeks were a frightening shade of pale blue. He realized then that his undercover experiment was no longer a corporate exercise. This was a matter of life. He reached into his pocket. He had a $1,000 limit on the decoy debit card he was carrying for the mission, but he knew he couldn't just hand over a card. It would look suspicious. "There's a 24-hour pharmacy 2 blocks over," Julian said. "They sell fleece blankets and thermal wraps. If you can walk, I'll help you get there." Sarah looked at him with intense suspicion. The streets had taught her that nothing was free, especially kindness from strangers in the dark. "Why?" Julian paused. He couldn't say he was a millionaire. He couldn't say he owned the building across the street. "Because I had a mother who stood in doors like this once," he said, tapping into a memory he usually kept locked in a vault. It was the truth. His success was a flight from a childhood of scarcity. Sarah saw the flicker of genuine pain in his eyes and nodded. She picked up Leo, her muscles screaming in protest. As they walked, Julian noticed her limp. She was wearing thin sneakers, soaked through with slush. "I'm Sarah," she said, her voice trembling. "Julian," he replied. As they reached the pharmacy, the fluorescent lights felt blinding. Julian grabbed a shopping basket. He didn't just grab one blanket. He grabbed 3. He grabbed heavy wool socks, a pair of children's insulated boots he found in the seasonal aisle, and several high-calorie protein bars. At the register, Sarah watched him with wide eyes. "I can't pay you back," she whispered. "You aren't the one who's supposed to pay," Julian muttered, sliding the card through the reader. The transaction cleared. For the first time in his life, the sight of a transaction-approved message gave him a rush of dopamine that no multi-million-dollar merger ever had. They sat in the back of a 24-hour laundromat, the only place that offered heat without immediate eviction. The smell of detergent and the hum of the dryers provided a surreal comfort. Leo was wrapped in 2 blankets, eating a granola bar with shaky hands. Julian sat on a plastic bench across from Sarah. The undercover CFO was gone. There was only a man confronted by the reality of his own city's failure. "How did it get this bad?" Julian asked. It wasn't a judgment. It was a genuine inquiry from a man who usually viewed poverty as a statistic on a spreadsheet. Sarah looked at the rotating clothes in a nearby dryer. "I worked at the Greasy Spoon for 5 years, never missed a shift. Then Leo got RSV. He was in the hospital for 2 weeks. I missed work. The owner found someone else and the hospital bills. They don't care if you're a good person, they just want the money. We lost the apartment in October." She looked at Julian. "You don't look like you're doing much better, if you don't mind me saying. But you spent $40 on us, why?" Julian looked at his rough, staged clothing. He felt like a fraud. "I'm searching for something," he said vaguely. "I spent too long looking at the world from the top of a tower. I forgot what the ground felt like." "The ground is hard," Sarah said, "and it's cold." As the night progressed, Julian listened. He learned about Sarah's degree in accounting that she never finished because of her pregnancy. He learned about Leo's love for dinosaurs and how Sarah used to read him books from the library until they lost their permanent address and could no longer check them out. Every word Sarah spoke was a nail in the coffin of Julian's previous worldview. He had spent his career streamlining companies, which often meant cutting redundant staff. He realized now that those redundancies were women like Sarah. They were people whose entire lives could be dismantled by a single bad week. "I have a friend," Julian said suddenly. "He works in corporate placement. If I could get you an interview, a real one, would you take it?" Sarah laughed, a dry, hollow sound. "Look at me, Julian. I'm wearing a blanket as a coat. I haven't showered in 3 days. People don't hire homeless for accounting jobs. They hire us to sweep floors if we're lucky, and even then, they want an address for the tax forms." "My friend is different," Julian said, his voice gaining that boardroom steel. "He doesn't care about the address, he cares about the skill, and I can tell you have the skill." The next morning, the sun rose over Chicago, a pale, heatless orb. Julian knew his time undercover was technically over, but his mission had changed. He couldn't just leave them in a laundromat. He led Sarah and Leo to a modest but clean residential hotel. He used his personal credit card this time, not the decoy. He told the clerk he was paying for a week in advance. Sarah tried to refuse, but Julian held up a hand. "Consider it a loan," he said. "From one person trying to survive to another." He left her with a bag of proper clothes he'd purchased at a nearby Target and a cheap burner phone. "There's a number saved in there. Call it at 10 a.m. Ask for the Sterling Initiative. They will be expecting you." Sarah watched him walk away into the morning fog. She felt like she was in a dream. The hot shower in the hotel room was the first time she had felt her own skin in weeks. As she scrubbed the grime of the streets away, she cried. She cried for the fear she had carried, and for the strange, rough-looking man who had looked at her not as a nuisance, but as a human being. Meanwhile, Julian returned to his penthouse. He stripped off the undercover rags and stepped into a shower that cost more than Sarah's lost apartment. He looked at himself in the mirror. He felt disgusted by the luxury, yet empowered by the realization that he had the tools to change the narrative. He called his executive assistant, Marcus. "Marcus, I need you to set up a new program immediately. The Sterling Bridge program. We are going to hire 5 individuals for the junior accounting and data entry departments. No address required for the initial 90 days. We provide a housing stipend up front." "Sir, the board will never approve an uncollateralized stipend," Marcus replied, stunned. "The board doesn't need to approve it," Julian snapped. "It's coming out of my personal dividend, and I have a candidate. Her name is Sarah Miller. If she calls, you treat her like she's a VIP candidate from Harvard. Clear?" "Perfectly, sir." Julian sat at his desk. He had spent years making money for people who already had too much. For the first time, he was excited about a Monday morning. Sarah stood in the lobby of Sterling Financial. She was terrified. She was wearing the simple black slacks and blue blouse Julian had bought for her. Her hair was pulled back tightly, hiding the split ends. Leo was at the hotel's daycare, a service Julian had quietly arranged. The lobby was a cathedral of wealth, marble floors, security gates, and people in suits that cost more than her car ever had. She felt like an intruder. "I'm here for the Sterling Initiative," she told the receptionist, her voice trembling. "My name is Sarah Miller." The receptionist's expression shifted instantly from professional coldness to a warm smile. "Ah, yes, Ms. Miller. We've been expecting you. Mr. Marcus is waiting." The interview wasn't like any Sarah had ever had. Marcus didn't ask why she was currently living in a hotel. He didn't ask about her gap in employment. Instead, he handed her a series of complex ledger sheets. "We were told you have a head for numbers," Marcus said. "Show me how you'd reconcile these discrepancies in the Q3 reports." Sarah looked at the numbers. For a moment, they blurred. Then the old instincts kicked in. Numbers didn't judge. Numbers were logical. They were a puzzle that had a solution, unlike the chaos of the streets. She took the pen and began to work. 20 minutes later, she handed the sheets back. Marcus looked them over. His eyebrows rose. "You found the rounding error in the tax depreciation. Most of our senior clerks miss that." "It was just hiding there," Sarah said, a small spark of confidence returning to her eyes. "Ms. Miller, the program offers a starting salary, a housing allowance, and a mentorship track. Can you start tomorrow?" Sarah leaned back in the chair. I don't have a permanent address yet." "Part of the program is a partnership with a corporate housing firm," Marcus explained. "We have a small apartment ready for you and your son. It's part of the compensation package." Sarah wanted to scream, to cry, to dance, but then a thought hit her. "Where is Julian? The man who told me about this?" Marcus hesitated. Julian had been very specific about remaining anonymous. "He's a consultant for the firm. He prefers to work in the background." The first month at Sterling Financial was a sensory overload for Sarah. After months of her world being reduced to the grey tones of concrete and the biting sting of frost, the office was a kaleidoscope of high-definition colours and sounds. The hum of the industrial-grade coffee machines, the rhythmic clicking of high heels on marble, and the hushed, urgent tones of high-stakes trading. Sarah worked harder than she ever had in her life. She was the first one through the security gates at 7 a.m., her eyes already scanning the digital ledgers, and she was often the one turning off the desk lamps at 9 p.m. Her new home was a sanctuary, a small, sun-drenched 2-bedroom apartment in Lincoln Park, provided by the Corporate Housing Initiative. It felt like a palace. For the first week, she couldn't stop touching the thermostat, marveling at the fact that she could command the heat to rise with a simple flick of her finger. Leo began to thrive in a way that brought tears to her eyes daily. His persistent, hacking street cough had vanished, replaced by the rambunctious, high-pitched energy of a healthy child. He had a bed with real sheets, a toy box, and a window where he could watch the city lights without being afraid of them. But Sarah was haunted. She couldn't stop thinking about the man from the laundromat, Julian, the man in the stained canvas jacket. She felt an overwhelming debt of gratitude that she couldn't repay. On her lunch breaks, she would take the L train back to Michigan Avenue. She walked past the luxury boutique where they first met, peering into the shadows. She visited the 24-hour pharmacy, asking the clerk if he'd seen a man matching Julian's description. She even spent an hour sitting in the back of the laundromat, hoping the door would swing open and he would walk in. He was gone, like a ghost that had appeared only when the frost was most lethal. In the office, rumors began to swirl about the iceberg CFO, Julian Vane. The junior analysts whispered in the break room that the man was glitching. He was pushing for social impact metrics to be included in every investment portfolio. He was being seen in the lower floors, the mailroom, the cafeteria, the data entry pools, asking employees about their commutes and their childcare. One rainy Tuesday afternoon, Sarah was asked to hand-deliver a hard copy of a reconciliation report to the executive floor. Her heart hammered against her ribs as the elevator rose. She stepped out onto the plush, silent carpet of the 40th floor. As she turned toward the executive wing, the elevator doors behind her chimed. She stepped inside to head back down, and there he was. But the man in the elevator wasn't wearing a canvas jacket. He was draped in a charcoal grey suit, tailored so perfectly it looked like armor. A silk tie the color of deep ocean water was knotted at his throat, and a watch that cost more than her old diner salary glittered under the LED lights. He was looking at a tablet, his brow furrowed in deep concentration. Sarah gasped, her breath catching. The heavy folder in her hand slipped, hitting the floor. Papers, months of her hard work, spilled across the elevator's polished metal floor like fallen snow. Julian looked down, startled. He saw her. He saw the woman he had pulled from the doorway. She looked radiant, her skin was clear, her hair was polished, and her eyes held a spark of professional fire. He saw the instant recognition in her gaze, followed by a wave of shock. "You," she whispered, her voice trembling. You're not like me." Julian reached out and hit the emergency stop button. The elevator jolted to a halt between the 34th and 35th floors, trapping them in a small, silent box of glass and steel. "Sarah," he said softly, his voice no longer raspy from the cold, but smooth and commanding. "You lied to me," she said, her voice rising with a mix of betrayal and confusion. "You played a game. You went undercover to see how the poor people live. Was it a social experiment? Did you get a good story for your board meetings while I was praying for a blanket?" Julian stepped toward her, but stopped when he saw her flinch. "It wasn't a game, Sarah. The board sent me out there to reconnect, yes. I went out there as a cynic. But then I saw you. When I saw you shielding Leo, it stopped being a corporate assignment. It became the only thing that mattered. I didn't help you because I wanted a story. I helped you because I realized I had spent my life building walls of wealth, and for the first time I wanted to build a bridge." "You could have told me," she sobbed, the papers still scattered at their feet. "If I had told you I was the CFO of this firm, would you have accepted that first blanket? Would you have let me walk you to the pharmacy? Or would you have thought I was some billionaire mocking your pain?" Sarah looked at the floor, her anger slowly giving way to the logic she loved so much. "I would have run away," she admitted. "I would have thought you were a predator." "Exactly," Julian said. "I needed to be Julian the man, not Julian the title. The job you have. I opened the door, but you walked through it. Marcus tells me you're the most gifted analyst he's seen in a decade. That wasn't a gift, Sarah. That was an opportunity you seized with both hands." The elevator began to move again, but the silence between them was different now. The secret was out. As Sarah stepped back onto her floor, she felt a strange shift. She wasn't just an employee anymore. She was a survivor who knew the secret of the man at the top. However, corporate ecosystems are rarely kind to outsiders. Word had begun to leak about the Sterling Bridge program. A rival executive named Robert Henderson, a man who measured his worth by the size of his acquisitions and the number of people he could intimidate, saw the program as a target. Henderson had wanted Julian's job for years, and he saw this charity work as the crack in Julian's armor. "Vane has lost his edge," Henderson whispered during a private lunch with 3 board members. "He's bringing the streets into the boardroom. He's using company capital for housing stipends for people with no credit history. It's a massive liability. What if they steal? What if they have criminal records we're too polite to check?" Henderson initiated a shadow audit. He didn't look at the work Sarah was doing. He looked at her past. He dug into her old medical debts, her eviction notice, and the 3 months she spent living in her car. He compiled a thick black binder titled Risk Assessment, the Bridge Initiative, aiming to present it at the quarterly board meeting to shut the program down and fire the high-risk hires, starting with Sarah. Sarah felt the temperature in the office drop. It wasn't the physical cold of Chicago, but the social cold of a corporate hit job. Henderson would walk past her desk and linger, looking at her with a mixture of pity and condescension, as if she were a stray dog that had accidentally wandered into a museum. One Friday evening, as a blizzard began to blanket the city, Sarah found Julian in the rooftop garden. The glass dome protected them from the snow, but the sky was a chaotic swirl of white. Julian looked exhausted, his tie loosened, leaning against the railing. "They're going to kill the program, aren't they?" Sarah asked, standing a respectful distance away. Julian didn't turn around. "Henderson is a man who sees a forest and only counts the lumber. He thinks empathy is a line item we can't afford. He's convinced the board that people like you are bad investments because of your past." Sarah walked up beside him, looking out at the frozen skyline. "Then, he's a bad businessman. Tell him to look at the Q4 reconciliation I just finished for the Midwest Holdings. I found a series of missed tax credits and overpayments that Henderson's Ivy League team overlooked for 3 consecutive years. I saved this firm $200,000 in 48 hours. Julian turned to her, his eyes widening. "You found the Midwest credits? We've had 3 auditing firms look at those books." "They were looking for big numbers," Sarah said, a flare of pride in her voice. "I'm an accountant who lived on $20 a week for months, Julian. I'm trained to find the pennies, and the pennies add up to a fortune. If I'm a bad investment, then his team is a bankruptcy waiting to happen." Julian felt a surge of adrenaline. The iceberg was gone. In its place was a man ready for a fight. "I have a board meeting on Tuesday morning. Henderson is going to try to bury you. I want you in that room." "Me? Julian, I'm just a junior analyst." "No," Julian said firmly. "You are the evidence. You are the human potential they've been ignoring. Don't prepare a speech, Sarah. Prepare the data." The Sterling Financial boardroom was a cathedral of old power. The walls were paneled in rare Macassar ebony, and the air smelled of expensive espresso and cold judgment. 12 board members sat around a mahogany table that was older than the city of Chicago itself. Robert Henderson stood at the head of the table, clicking through a PowerPoint presentation. "As you can see on slide 12, Henderson said, his voice oily and confident, "the bridge program has introduced a 15% increase in unstable background variables. We are a financial institution, not a halfway house. I move that we dissolve the program immediately to protect our shareholders." The chairman, a man who looked like he was carved from granite, nodded slowly. "Julian, do you have a rebuttal for these risk factors?" Julian stood up. He didn't look at his notes. He looked directly at Henderson. "Data is only as good as the person interpreting it, Robert. You see risk. I see untapped ROI. And I'd like to introduce our lead witness for the defense." The heavy double doors opened, and Sarah walked in. She was wearing a sharp charcoal suit, a mirror of the one Julian had worn in the elevator. Her heart was racing so fast she feared it might burst, but she thought of Leo. She thought of the cold, the cardboard, and the security guard who had locked the door on them. She wasn't just fighting for her job, she was fighting for the dignity of every person Henderson wanted to erase. "My name is Sarah Miller," she began, her voice echoing in the vast room. 3 months ago, I was standing on Michigan Avenue begging for a blanket to keep my son from freezing. Today, I am the analyst who recovered $200,000 in lost revenue for this firm." She walked around the table, placing a 1-page color-coded report in front of each board member. It was a masterpiece of clarity, concise, undeniable, and devastating to Henderson's narrative. "Mr. Henderson calls us unqualified," Sarah continued, her voice gaining a steely edge. "But people who have survived with nothing are the most qualified people in this building. We know how to stretch a dollar because we've had to make a dollar last a week. We know how to solve problems when there is no easy answer. We don't take this air conditioning for granted. We don't take this coffee for granted. We work as if our lives depend on it, because for us, they do." The room went deathly silent. One board member, A woman named Mrs. Gable, who was known for her ruthlessness, leaned forward and adjusted her glasses. She looked at Sarah's report, then at Henderson. "Robert," Mrs. Gable said, her voice like a paper cut, "why did your senior audit team miss this $200,000 tax credit for 3 years? It's right here in the depreciation schedules." Henderson stammered, his face turning a blotchy red. It was a minor oversight in a multi-billion-dollar portfolio. A rounding error, really." "It wasn't a rounding error," Sarah countered firmly. "It was an oversight of neglect. You didn't look because you didn't think you had to. I looked because I know that every cent matters." Mrs. Gable looked at Julian. "I don't see a liability, Julian. I see a competitive advantage. I want this program expanded. If there are more Sarah Millers out there, I want them working for Sterling, not our competitors." The motion to dissolve the program was not only defeated, a new motion was passed to triple the bridge program's budget. Henderson gathered his things in a quiet, humiliated fury and slunk out of the room. The transition from survival to stability was a slow, quiet miracle. With the bridge program legally secured and the board's blessing, Sarah felt a phantom weight lift from her shoulders. For months, she had lived in a state of hypervigilance, waiting for the other shoe to drop, waiting for someone to realize she didn't belong. But now she belonged. She was no longer a charity case or a social experiment. She was a cornerstone of the finance department, an analyst whose keen eye for detail saved the firm more than most senior partners did. Her salary was officially adjusted to reflect her true market value. One of her first acts was to visit Julian's office. She placed an envelope on his desk, the exact amount he had spent on that first week's hotel stay and the initial supplies. Julian had tried to wave it off, his face softening with a look of genuine discomfort. "Sarah, please, consider it a gift between friends." "I can't," she had replied, her voice firm but kind. "To move forward, I need to know I've paid my own way." "This isn't about the money, Julian. It's about my pride. It's about being equal." Julian looked at her, really looked at her, and realized that for Sarah, this envelope was her final declaration of independence. He accepted it with a nod of deep respect. A few weeks later, the brutal Chicago winter finally surrendered. May arrived, turning the gray city into a lush, vibrant green. Julian invited Sarah and Leo to Millennium Park. The afternoon was a dream of blue skies and gentle breezes. The famous Cloud Gate sculpture, the Bean, glittered in the center of the plaza, reflecting the jagged Chicago skyline in distorted, beautiful silver. Leo was a different child. He was running across the grass, chasing a toy airplane, his laughter a bright, clear bell that didn't have a hint of the raspy tremor that had haunted his lungs in December. Julian and Sarah sat on a wooden bench, watching the boys sprint with endless energy. "I wanted to say thank you," Sarah said softly, her eyes following her son. "Not just for the job or the apartment, but for seeing me that night. Millions of people walk past the homeless every day. They see a problem, or they see a nuisance. They see a statistic that makes them uncomfortable. You saw a person, you saw a mother." Julian leaned back, looking up at the drifting clouds. "You healed me too, Sarah. I was becoming a machine. I lived in a world of percentages and margins. I thought success was a number on a high-definition screen. I had forgotten that the only wealth that truly matters is the kind you can share. I was more lost in that tower than you were on the street. You gave me back my humanity." He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small wrapped box. "This isn't from the company. It's a personal gift for Leo, for his 5th birthday next week." Sarah opened the box. Inside was a high-quality, weighted wool blanket. It wasn't store-bought. It was custom-made, incredibly soft to the touch, and embroidered in the corner with a small golden brontosaurus wearing a crown. "So he never has to worry about the cold again," Julian said, his voice thick with emotion. "No matter where he goes in life, no matter how hard the wind blows, he'll carry his own warmth." Tears blurred Sarah's vision as she ran her fingers over the embroidery. The golden dinosaur seemed to shimmer in the sun. "He won't," she whispered, "and neither will I." They sat in a long, comfortable silence, watching the city breathe around them, Chicago still had its shadows, and the winter would inevitably return, but there was a pocket of light here that hadn't existed before. Julian looked at Sarah, and for the first time there was no hierarchy. There was no CFO and no analyst. There were just two people who had found a common language in the silence of a laundromat and the hope of a new beginning. "What's next for you, Sarah?" "I'm sitting for my CPA exam next month," she said with a confident grin. "And then I want to take over the day-to-day of the bridge program. I want to be the one who stands in that lobby and says, 'Welcome home,' to the next person who walks through those doors with nothing but a hope and a prayer." Julian laughed, a genuine warm sound. "I think you're overqualified, but I wouldn't trust anyone else with the soul of this company." The Sterling Bridge program was no longer just a department. It was a movement. It had been featured in the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times as the gold standard for corporate social responsibility in the United States. Other Fortune 500 companies were calling, asking for the Miller Vein blueprint. Hundreds of families had been transitioned from the freezing streets into stable, high-paying careers, proving that the cycle of poverty could be broken with a single, well-placed bridge. Sarah Miller's life was unrecognizable from the year before. She was now the Director of Outreach and Social Impact. She had her own office on the 32nd floor with a wide window that looked out over the curving Chicago River. On her mahogany desk sat two photos. One was a professional portrait of her and Leo at the park, both of them beaming. The second was a grainy black-and-white security camera, still, a man in a worn canvas jacket helping a woman in a laundromat. She kept it there as an anchor to remind her exactly where the bridge began. Leo was in kindergarten now. He was the smartest kid in his class, obsessed with science and, as always, dinosaurs. He had a stable life, a bedroom filled with books, a full stomach, and a mother he called his hero. He still slept with his golden dinosaur blanket every single night. Every Christmas Eve, while the rest of the corporate world was at the firm's lavish black-tie gala at the Drake Hotel, Sarah and Julian kept a different tradition. They didn't wear tuxedos or silk gowns. They wore heavy parkas and thick boots. They rented a large white van and filled it to the roof with high-quality blankets, thermal socks, hot thermoses of coffee, and, most importantly, laminated resource cards. As a fresh layer of snow began to fall over Michigan Avenue, Sarah stepped out of the van. The wind was howling just as it had been 2 years prior. She saw a young woman huddled in the very same doorway where Sarah had once stood. The woman was clutching a toddler to her chest, her eyes wide with that specific hollow exhaustion that comes from the bone-deep fear of the dark. Sarah didn't just hand her a blanket from a distance. She walked over and knelt directly in the slush, ignoring the cold soaking into her knees. She looked the woman directly in the eye, offering a smile that was warm enough to melt the ice between them. "It's a brutal night," Sarah said softly, handing her a steaming cup of coffee and a heavy wool blanket. "I know it feels like the world has shut its doors on you. I know it feels like you're invisible to every person walking past." The woman looked up, her lips a faint shade of blue, her hand trembling violently as she took the cup. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the wind. Sarah reached into her pocket and handed her the card. "My name is Sarah. I stood in this exact doorway 2 years ago. I was exactly where you are. If you call this number tomorrow morning, I will be the one on the other end of the line. We have a place for you to stay tonight, and we have a path for you to walk tomorrow. Please don't give up. The winter is long, but it doesn't have to last forever." The woman looked at the card, then back at Sarah's face. For the first time that night, the woman's shoulders dropped. The tension of survival began to thaw, and a tiny, fragile spark of hope flickered to life in her eyes. Julian stood a few feet back by the van, watching Sarah work. He realized then that his greatest achievement wouldn't be the billions of dollars he managed or the skyscrapers that bore his firm's name. His true legacy was the warmth that Sarah was now passing on to the next person in line. The iceberg had not just melted, it had become a river that was feeding the soul of the city. This wasn't a fairy tale with magic wands, glass slippers, or impossible spells. It was a story of human sight, the simple, revolutionary, and deeply realistic act of seeing another person's pain and deciding that it belonged to you, too. As the snow fell thicker, Turning Chicago into a white-muffled dream, Sarah and Julian climbed back into the van. They drove away into the heart of the city, leaving a trail of warmth and hope behind them in the dark, proving once and for all that even in the coldest places on earth, the human heart, when guided by empathy, can always find a way to keep the fire burning for those still out in the storm.